Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Doing More with Less for More, Rebuilding Capital in a Circular Economy. My name is Ben Simmons, head of the Green Growth Knowledge Platform. It is our great pleasure to be collaborating today with the German Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature, Conservation, and Nuclear Safety, the International Climate Initiative, and GIZ under the Resource Efficiency and Climate Action Initiative in the organization of today's webinar. As you all know, the IPCC launched a new report just 2 days ago with its clearest warning to date that we are on a course in just over a decade to surpass the carbon budget for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. What the report also made abundantly clear is that addressing this challenge will require action on all fronts, limiting future emissions, lifestyle changes, and carbon sequestration. Undoubtedly, part of that solution is the creation of a sustainable and efficient economic system, which is also the focus of today's webinar, where we will hear the perspectives from 3 leading experts on circular economy and resource efficiency. However, before introducing the moderator for today's event, I would like to just make a few very brief announcements. The first is about an exciting service called Expert Connect that the GGKP recently launched along with the Partnership for Action on Green Economy. This service is focused on providing governments with direct, tailored pro bono advice and guidance from leading global experts on a range of green growth topics. I would encourage you to take a look at our website for more information on this service. I also wanted to remind participants that the GGKP will be organizing its 6th annual conference that will take place from the 27th to the 29th of November 2018 in conjunction with the OECD's 2018 Green Growth and Sustainable Development Forum. This year's theme will be on inclusive solutions for the green transition, and it will focus on issues around competitiveness, jobs and reskilling, and social equity. Finally, I would like to highlight a few logistical issues for today's webinar. First, we strongly encourage participants to raise questions throughout the webinar. This can be done by typing your question into the chat box, which you can find on the right-hand side of the webinar dashboard. Your questions will be submitted to our technical staff here at the Green Growth Knowledge Platform, who will then repost them to all of the webinar participants for a panelist to address during the question and answer period. After the webinar, we will also be circulating a 5-minute survey. We kindly request that you take the time to complete it. It provides us with extremely valuable feedback that helps shape our future webinars. If you have any technical issues throughout the webinar period, do let us know. You can email us at contact@ggkp.org and we will help you troubleshoot and overcome those problems. Finally, please note that all of the presentations you see here, as well as a recording of the webinar, will be available on the GGKP website shortly after the webinar. In addition, if you're interested in more information, tools, data, and case studies on circular economy, I would encourage you to visit the GGKP website, where we have a section dedicated to the theme of circular economy. So without further ado, I now have the honor to introduce our moderator today, Connie Schumach, a well-known speaker, media coach, and conference facilitator. Connie has served in many capacities, recently as a media advisory board member of the think tank Global Economic Solutions, and as a journalist, producer, and moderator for the G20 Resource Efficiency Dialogue. Connie, I am absolutely delighted to welcome you to today's webinar, and it is my great pleasure to turn the virtual podium over to you.
Thank you very much, Ben, and hello, everybody. We've just heard from Ben that we all heard the final call to save the world from climate catastrophe. And of course, I'm referring to the 1.5-degree report by the IPCC. Equally, it may have not gone unnoticed that 2 economists who made calculating the cost of environmental and social impact of climate change possible have just received the Nobel Prize in economics. So basically, a lot of thinking people today have arrived at the conviction that we need resource efficiency and ultimately a circular economy to achieve both climate action goals and the SDGs in 2030. So the questions we want to tackle today are: how can we get to a circular economy? What are the key steps? What are the technologies and skills for a circular future? And we have premeditated a couple of questions that we may discuss afterwards, like, for example, what policies are most impactful impactful in order to create a circular economy. Why aren't more politicians and more business leaders going that way? Where are the hurdles? And maybe also there might be some sectors that are particularly prone to gather the low-hanging fruit on the circular economy and thereby serve as benchmarks. And last but not least, how can ICT, i.e. how can the internet, how can digitization, how can big data and AI help us gather the benefits of a circular economy? So many questions, and we have today 3 absolute experts here at this webinar. I'll be introducing them shortly. As you know, if you're already partaken in one of our webinars, we need your input and your inspiration. So please shower us with questions and give us your thoughts. So let me work backwards. The third presenter is going to talk about something that just happened in Argentina 2 months ago. The G20, just as much as the G7 before, have put resource efficiency firmly on their agenda 1 year ago, and they started a formal dialogue to share diverse country experiences. For the meeting hosted in Argentina by the Argentinian presidency this summer, they requested a special report by the International Research Panel, and Peda Jensen, the head of the Secretariat of the International Resource Panel, which is located at UN Environment in Paris, is going to share the highlights of this report. Before that, we will hear from René van Berkel on issues of productivity and innovation towards circular economy. René is with UNIDO in Vienna as the head of the unit responsible for cleaner and sustainable production programs. And to kick off, we will have to answer one important question. How about the money? Who is paying for it all? If you have change, it will cost you a ton of money right at the beginning, even if it serves a great purpose and even if it gains a win-win situation in the end. Zinat Niazi will share her analysis with us. She is Vice President of the Development Alternatives Group, more than a quarter of a century experience in the social and environmental development sector. And just before you kick off, Zinat, we know that India is the only country to have actually emulated the International Research Panel with a national resource panel. So it seems to be that a lot of things are happening there, but of course that was only the last 2 years, and many organizations such as yours have been working on the idea and practicalities of the circular economy before that. So just take it away, take us onto the path of the Indian experience.
Yeah, thank you, Connie, and thank you, Ben. And thank you for this very kind introduction. And as I get into my presentation, and like you pointed out, I would touch upon the new developments in India, especially related to the Indian National Resource Panel that has been recently launched. And so thank you again for this opportunity, and good day to everybody who's linked on today to the webinar. What I'm going to do is to take you through a few points and a few issues. This is the transition to the circular economy that we are seeing, and the presenters after me would probably go much greater into detail. But I will jump very quickly into the policy scenario of India in relation to resource efficiency and circular economy approaches, some potential opportunities that we see, and also if we have to harness the real benefits of the circular economy to be a win-win for all, to be able to achieve SDGs. There will be certain riders and certain conditionalities and a reference to the context that we would have to address, and I would like to touch upon that as well. If we look at the process that's going on, we're in the midst of a transition from the linear take, make, use, throw, with a lot of waste at every stage of the process, including the end of pipe, to a much more looped economy process, which still has some amount of waste in the process that's happening. And most countries, however, are still dominated by the linear processes. And the initial steps of the 3 R's, the reduce, reuse, recycle kind of steps, have sort of now, and the slide that you see now, the diagram from Alan MacArthur's work on circular economy is basically looking at a new approach towards the industrial ecology, and how a systemic thinking of connecting resources, not just through one sector, but through multiple sectors, reusing, refurbishing, etc., would probably bring us much closer to the kind of circularity that we are talking about. But what we need to understand is that both, the approaches of circular economy, which began from the idea of waste minimization, have unintegrated into them the resource efficiency issues. They primarily, are gaining sort of currency due to the dual pressures of environmental degradation, as well as environmental degradation, as well as the need to look at the price increases because of resource stresses, and which impacts the profitability of businesses. And this is important because the drivers that we are talking about are coming from very much at the moment the business end, and we'll come to it a little later on how, therefore, the businesses and public sector need to probably come together. But just as we move ahead, we see, even though that there is a huge concern on the issue of resource, the quantum of extraction of resources, the fact that even as we go, moving towards the 2030, 2050, we might be seeing some amount of relative decoupling, but mainly what we do see is an absolute increase in materiality going forward. The journey really for the circular economy approaches, which began with the pollution prevention, waste minimization, and brought into, much later, the whole concept of cleaner production and the 3 R's, has now reached a level where you have, on the one hand, a parallel blue economy thinking, not to be confused with the marine economy, but here is where the maximizing of value from resources across different sectors within a local system thinking is coming in, and the green economy thinking, which is looking at also, in addition, inclusion and circularity, which needs to bring about which attempts to bring about both of these issues, including the efficiency aspects into it, is really the next step for this. Before we sort of move into the situation in India now, we really would like to jump into that. What really is India? I mean, you have a country which is, rapidly growing. It is, on average 7% GDP. Which has an aspiring middle class. It has, it's amongst the youngest countries, if you look at the age group, a very robust manufacturing sector. We are at the crest of, and really we are, at the top of the digital revolution. We are a country of startups at the moment, and new business models. So it's an interesting space. It's a happening space at the moment. But on the other hand, India is also a country of great divides. If you look at the latest Oxfam report, the World Inequality Index that they have taken out, we are amongst the bottom 10 of I think 115 or 116 countries that they have mapped. Between the rich and the poor, whether you look at the rural and the urban sectors, there is a huge huge inequity issue. We also have the world's largest absolute numbers of absolute poor, and we have a culture of frugal consumerism, which is now coming in conflict really with the global take, use, throw, discard consumer behavior. So and so we are a country of sort of contradictions. And very interestingly, the key strength of our economy is from the small and medium sector, the micro, small and medium sector, I should say, and the informal sector. And the informal sector here is one which is not really counted in the GDP. So it's interesting when we talk about resource decoupling from GDP, there is this huge activity on the ground in the informal sector which is not really being counted, and therefore it's not even being addressed through the improvement in the production processes. Trends in India actually indicate that we have an economy in key sectors. We have, especially from the large and formal sectors, we made great strides in material and energy efficiency, no doubt about it. Whether you look at the cement sector, for example, the steel sector, etc. But the absolute material consumption is steadily growing across all sectors. So we may see a relative decoupling from of resources and CO2 from GDP, but there is an absolute growth, and we do not see a de-acceleration in resource consumption in the next few years. If you look at this slide where, with respect to the world, India's resource metabolism rate is also very low, which indicates that there is a need for us to be growing forward if all of our population has to reach a kind of a quality of life that is desirable and adequate. Taken alongside the fact that we are also doing not very great on the HDI index, I mean, we need to have new approaches to move into that bottom, corner where we have both high human development indices and a low ecological footprint. So obviously, we need very different models of development. Even looking at circularity, what would be the model of circularity that we would be sort of approaching? The rate of consumption, and I'll just go very quickly in the next couple of sort of data. If you look at these scenarios that have been developed in 2013, and if we were to grow really rapidly, which is that light green that you see, we would be jumping almost 10 times. In our resource consumption per year by 2050, even in the most modest worst case scenarios, we are still jumping about 4 times. And in the current scenario, which is really where the 7% to 7.5% growth is, we are still going to be doing a 5-time resource consumption by 2050. Given this situation, what do we see? And where is this resource consumption really going to be coming from? If you see if you sectorally look at the kind of materials, you see the maximum quantum. I mean, what is going to dominate our future material consumption is going to be the abiotic materials. These are the minerals, the sand, aggregates, etc. And this is where my next sort of work discussion in the presentation, which is where these materials are going to be used for, is going to come through, which is in the construction sector. So we will deal with the construction sector in a couple of slides, and understanding that the government, the government is very cognizant of this fact that we have a situation on our hands. Right in the 12th five-year plan, which was the last five-year plan that we had, and that ended in 2017 before our planning commission was disbanded, we had sort of indicated very clearly that we would be looking for a development pathway which looks at the conservation of environment along with cleaner, more efficient systems of production, but also addressing behavioral patterns of consumption. So the government of India, if I look at their sort of policy programmatic approaches, and you had noted the Indian National Resource Panel, which is really one of the huge leap forwards that we have made in the institutional systems, that is marked in red. I'm not going through all of these. the national resource efficiency strategy that was released by and through efforts of this panel by the Niti Aayog, our new planning commission think tank, are really on the cutting edge at the moment. There are other programs such as the Zero Effect, Zero Defect, which is looking at closing the loops within production systems. There is increasing now thought about the support to the MSMEs, and interestingly, there is the SEBI, which is it's basically the Security and Exchange Board of India, that is introducing mechanisms that will encourage and facilitate green bond issuances, and hopefully we see not very far in the day sovereign green bonds, which would be interesting space to look at financial investments into the circular economy thinking and models. But what we must see as we go forward is, as we design circular economy models for India, what we should be considering. We should be considering the growth model drivers, of course, and urbanization is being the biggest here. The consumption patterns, the fact that we have a rapidly growing, aspiring middle class, we have and the environmental impact. So all of these issues are something that, in any case, the resource economy approaches look at. But the last two, I think, is something that is typical of countries such as India. One is the criticality of resources, which is coming from a range of issues. Especially because there's that much more demand that is coming up, and the final one, which is the potential of employment, the potential that circular economy approaches can actually unleash and leverage. And looking at, if you look at those kind of approaches with that understanding, to look at how do we what are the sectors, what are the low-hanging fruit at the moment, then this is what we see. Construction sector with an eye on housing, which is the largest growing space, also the space which is using up maximum of those resources, where the mineral resources we spoke about. The urban services, as the cities grow and that many more new greenfield cities come in. Agriculture, where land and water is becoming stressed, and land is actually now in a situation where we have conflict between urbanization and agriculture increasingly that we see. We see furnishings and textiles and packaging. That's the FMCG sector, because we have to address the demands of the aspiring middle class, and that's where a large change can start happening. Let's look specifically into the construction sector and the construction value chain. It's been one of those sectors where huge win-wins for the environment, for the society, for the businesses are being seen, not just through looking at circularity of material and energy flows across within the sector, but also how this sector links with other economic sectors, which is an interesting space. Construction, it's been said that we have about 2/3 of India yet to be built. And in that 2/3 of India, most of it is going to be urban housing, and most of it is going to be housing for the lower and economic groups and the low middle class, which means that we have a huge affordable housing market which needs to be supported and built. And this will be driven, the criticality of materials, which we define as a relationship between scarcity that drives cost, environmental impact, and embodied energy required for processing, supply risks for business, lack of recyclability currently in many of the technological methods of using construction, but most importantly is criticality coming from the conflict of use or the opportunity cost of resources. And here is where the four key materials of land, soil, iron and steel, so iron, limestone, and sand, and other construction stones. So it is these five materials which are really the ones that are causing us sleepless nights, and causing many policymakers also sleepless nights, including builders and developers. But it's the sleepless nights. There is, on the other hand, the the models for the new models of business need to be driven from what is the potential, and the potential really here is not just savings in capital and operational costs, but also the reduced impact, new economy opportunities, but most importantly, new green jobs and skills. This one last aspect, which is not very well considered in the design of circular models when we look at efficiency of resources, specifically because the difference between the value that is given to capital versus value given to labor in production systems is is really skewed. And that's what is something that we really need to address. And so new jobs and skills in the construction sector, which is a huge potential and a huge need. Construction sector being also the second largest employer currently. New models have to consider how this will be addressed. Very quickly, I will take you through some interesting examples. What is happening in the construction sector? What you see here is construction demolition waste, debris coming out of the sector. And as new cities are getting built, more construction waste is coming into the stream. But the construction demolition waste is being converted back. And there are now technology models. Again, I must point out that the technical models are only available at the moment for large scale conversion of debris back into material. But we still need to address the needs of smaller municipalities and smaller scales of debris availability. And we also need to see how municipalities are looking at debris not just as waste management, but as new resource potential. The second arena, where again, I think from the policy space has been a huge movement because we have a Flyash use notification. This is coming out of the waste from the power generation sector, and this material, which is probably amongst the largest pollutants in our country, is now mandated to be used in construction in various forms, already being picked up by the cement industry, by the brick making industry, etc. So there is a conversion that is happening. A huge potential here to provide new jobs and new material for the growing India. The foundry sector, from the iron and steel, from where looking at how we can get aggregates. Again, sand and aggregates is a space which is stressed, and this is where we need materials, and the steel mining sector can give us this and provide us again with materials for pavings and new urban systems that we can be building. The cement sector, now this is something which is new, only a few years old. There is research and I think pre-commercial production at the moment, which is now looking at waste from the from the clay mines. So the waste material from the mines, which can replace virgin limestone to quite some extent, and be able to produce the same quality of cement and materials by reducing not just the energy needs, but also the virgin material requirement into the cement. This is something that's being looked at with great interest, and I'm proud to say that Development Alternatives has been a leading actor in the development of this material, as well as its commercialization processes which are happening at the moment. These are some of the applications that you see. I want to end my presentation with an explanation, with a discussion on a model of using all of such materials in an urban context, which is like an iconic building within which is the headquarters of Development Alternatives itself. What used to be a total earth construction, earth building, what you see on your screen at the moment, by 2011, we had reconverted it into something which was more in line with the needs of today. And this is besides the fact that it's a beautiful building, it's also a building which sort of demonstrates circularity to a very high extent. You have almost 80% material recovery from the old building into the new one. We have a 50% reduction in our materials rucksack, 30% less steel and cement. We have used industrial waste in all the in the materials that we have used for the construction, whether it were bricks or whether it were in the roofing material. We have 100% harvested our water and recycle it back. We have 35% reduction in energy consumption at the embodied energy level and the same amount in the operational energy as we go forward. And all of this were done through localized production methods, small contractual and artisanal skill sets, leading to job creation. So it is possible to match the needs of circularity with the potential of local economic development, and that I think is something that I would like to emphasize and re-emphasize. Going beyond, what we have been thinking in circular economy, we move from decoupling resources from GDP, but actually decoupling resources from development, and not just the growth. Will require zero waste, closing loops across all sectors. It will require keeping the resources in their highest value for the maximum possible time, returning to the environment then in their original form, treating, which will also mean that we will be moving much more into the biotic systems, and the relationship between the biotic, abiotic system synergies will be required. Much more cooperation and collaboration, much more product to service thinking, even in economies like India. So sharing spaces will become important for us. For example, Airbnb is an example that comes to my mind, where a large amount of real estate need not get newly constructed, but can be used from what already exists. But most importantly, we will need to start rethinking how do we reduce the distance between production and consumption, and how do we change the labor capital balance in production economics. These are the two aspects which will be critical for the Indian and similar economy models. And last, the fact that as we move in this direction of mainstreaming circular economy, thinking across, being able to achieve the SDG goal, we might, in contexts like India, really start thinking of what Kate Raworth had been talking about. So you spoke, Tony, of the two economists who've been who've just got the Nobel Prize, and I think it is going to be the economists with a novel way of thinking who will probably take us into the new economy that we are really looking for, and maybe it is the economy with the whole that we need to look at. So it's the circle with the whole that is going to go, that we will probably be looking towards. So thank you very much for this opportunity. Again, what you see on the screen is a typical small decentralized production plant using waste materials and giving jobs. Really a picture that I would like our audience to keep in their minds. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Seenat. Very fascinating, and I think we're going to pick up a couple of points. We already have a number of questions by participants, but let me just sort of pinpoint or put one thing into your mind, and maybe you can share with us. Your headquarter building seems to have been a great success, and it's, of course, being with development alternatives, you have to show up alternatives. How much effort did go into both the planning? I mean, you're an architect yourself and a planner yourself. So how much effort did you have to put into planning, constructing the building so that it can serve as an example for others?
It's very interesting that you asked us this, Connie. We actually had a very democratic system of planning and designing, where the principles of design, and we're saying rethink design. So the principles of design, which included things like the fact that we will reuse all our old material, were established right at the beginning. And then we actually worked with our architect who designed our building to put those principles into practice. And because a lot of the work on technology models, etc., and on production models had been done by the DA system earlier, we said we will bring it all in. So in a sense, yes, for us, it was not that difficult once you've made up your mind that this is where you need to go. And you realize that it's not that expensive. It wasn't really as expensive as we were thinking it would be.
It was less expensive than a conventional?
No, I think at the time of construction, we were at par.
Okay. Thank you very much, and I think we defer the further discussion to later on because we already have in line René van Berkel. As I said, he's with UNIDO, United Nations Industrial Development Organization, and he is actually at the head of a program that is operational in some 50 emerging countries. So I think you must have put together quite a number of examples and quite a lot of things that you can take us along the path. And let me remind you that we already have a lot of questions by people, so please stick to your 15 minutes. René? Okay, I'm not quite sure, René, whether you can hear us. It seems that we can't hear you. So maybe you have to sort of change something in your settings on the audio channel so that we can profit from your knowledge. René, I'm not quite sure whether you can see me or whether you're concentrating on your charts. You seem to have muted yourself, which is rather sad because I'm quite sure that the kickoff for doing more with less for more is absolutely fascinating. So
okay.
Oh, there you are. Great.
Yeah, there we are. So okay, so let's see. Let's close this one. Then I think you should be able to see the screen. So thank you very much. Sorry for this short hiccup, but I want to indeed talk about doing more with less for more and focus a bit on productivity and innovation in the circular economy. So if I go, I seem not to be able to move the presentation. Let me see. Yes, this works. So I have here the diagram, which is basically from the resources panel, which shows that economic activity would normally go with increased resource use and increased environmental impact. And of course, we want to do more, so increase the economy with less. That is the resource decoupling and impact decoupling, so having less environmental impact, less resource consumption. But I would also like to add the element for more. So we're also looking at decoupling human well-being from economic activity. So maybe less material wealth, but still increased human well-being. So with that, I think that already mentioned the work that the MacArthur Foundation did, which is sort of looking more at changing the take, make, and dispose extractive industrial model to restorative and regenerative and system-wide innovation. But I would like to add there on the kind of the business perspective, which is brought forward by the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And they talk more about the circular economy as a new way of looking at the relationship between markets, customers, and natural resources, and then looking at the new business models and disruptive technologies that transform then the linear economic model. So zooming in on that, they have then gone on and to say basically the circular economy is 5 business models and 3 disruptive technologies and the combinations that are there. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you see then the 5 business models, which is basically product life extension. So extending the useful time of a product so that products are used for a longer period of time. And the sharing platform is looking at the increased intensity of use. So multiple people making use of the same product. Resource recovery is then looking at what is left over at the end of a useful life of a product and what can be materials and other elements can be taken out of that. And product as a service is saying that we don't need to own everything that we use, certainly not if it's only temporarily used or very short period of time used. And then the circular supplies focuses on using renewable and biomaterials. And that's then coupled with the emergence of 3 technologies. And that links quite much to the innovation and productivity aspect. So first of all, we see then the onset of the sort of digital technologies, and in particular then the Internet of Things, or what we generally refer to as Industry 4.0, the transformation that we see starting to shape from mass production to mass customization. Then we have a combination with the physical changes. So we see new materials being developed, new technologies, partially enabled by digital, which is, for example, the additive manufacturing or the 3D printing and the nanotechnologies that we have. And then we see that also combined with an emergence of biological or green technologies, which are based around enzymes and natural-based processes. So it's this combination of 3 disruptive technologies and different business models, which creates then the circular economy. From UNIDO's side, we have put this diagram out, which is sort of then say the 4 elements: generate increased income at the top right corner, then reduce resource dependency, minimize waste, and reduce environmental footprint. But I think I would like to add 3 dimensions to that. And I think that one of the first one is that we should go renewable, so maximize the use of renewable materials, water, and energy. Then the second component which is in there is to do basically more with less, so to practice relentlessly resource efficiency practices. And then the third element is then the perpetuality of the recycling. So if we talk about circularity, and it's not just about one reuse or recycle, but it's about being able to reuse and recycle the same materials for many multiple, in principle, perpetually. So we then often say that we should not confine the circular economy to recycling economy, but it's a real new way of doing economic production and consumption with renewables, with a maximum possible efficiency of use, and then keeping materials in the loop. So let me elaborate on each of those 3. So go renewables, and we would be to resource and man-made systems, so that's our economy, to nature's capability of supplying materials. So then we could have the element of nature as an input, so substitute non-renewable inputs to man-made systems, so using renewable materials, renewable energy, water in a way that is that does not undermine the catchment areas, the ecological functions, and land and biodiversity. So it's extraction at rates compatible with the long-term availabilities and cycles. And we can basically also put in there the kind of the nature as a mentor. So how can we see natural processes that are happening in the environment? How can they be incorporated into industrial products and processes? And that is the fields like some people have known, biomimicry, green chemistry, green engineering. So let me take a few examples of what today's opportunities are already. So first of all, I want them to highlight maybe the kind of the opportunities that are around solar heating of industrial processes. And you see here on the first example is an example of advanced dehydration unit based on conduction, convection, and radiation. So it's an advanced thing of a greenhouse to dry basically fruits and vegetables, and in that sense create income also for small communities. This is done by Science for Society Technologies, S4S. We can then go even at bigger end, so where you can say up to 400 degrees centigrade, roughly you can do with what is called concentrated solar thermal technologies, and they cover about 50% of the industrial heat use. So many processes like dairy, textiles, leather, they can just run directly on solar heat. We don't have to go to the route of producing electricity and then heating up processes there. So if I take the second one on the kind of the innovation, I want to here use just Watson, which is one company that we worked with in the Clean Tech program, which is basically water purification without chemicals or energy using nanomaterials, which are also inspired by nature. Another example is then comes from Cellzyme biotechnology, which has developed enzymes as a biocatalyst for the production of antibiotics, and the antibiotics can then be made at room temperature rather than at minus 20, 30 or 20, 30 degrees without solvents, which would otherwise be emitted into the environment, and with higher efficiency. So we see new processes coming because of this biotechnology, which is basically using enzymes. So then I want to go to the second part, which is doing more with less. And Zinat already referred to some of the work that UNIDO is doing with UNEP, UN Environment, on resource efficient and clean production. And this is basically the kind of the three elements which I have here set here. So resource efficiency is basically making more dollars per kilogram of material being used or per kilowatt hour of energy being used. So improve the efficiency of materials, water, and energy. If we do so, we have less materials left to throw away. So we generate less waste, effluents, and emissions. And if we do that, we improve then also occupational and community health and well-being, which in turn then also improves productivity. So we say this is a kind of a virtuous synergy. It's an overarching framework that once we start focusing on efficient use of resources, we minimize waste and we improve productivity and well-being. So this is an overarching concept that we've been working on, and then you see here some of the practical ways of doing this. So starting with good housekeeping, with organizational measures, cheap ways of basically fixing things, and input change using the right input materials, measuring what is being done with better process control, and modifying equipment so that the efficiency is higher with insulation or better balancing of production lines, and going also to new technologies which are more efficient by design. That we could look at reuse and recycling within the boundaries of a factory, or moving producing a useful byproduct which somebody else can use, or ultimately looking at product modification. We could almost say that these are different 8 lenses by which we could look at the manufacturing process and then come up with resource efficient and cleaner production solutions, or RECP, as a recipe. Just to give some examples, this is work which in India was done with our partner, the Gujarat Cleaner Production Center. You see here the summary of what was done in the textile sector. You see 6 companies were assisted, and then you see savings of electricity in the range of 350,000 kilowatt hours, 2,000 tons of coal saved, and you see also monetary savings, 42 million rupees saving per year. If you translate that, that's almost $100,000 per each of the companies. And on the right-hand side, you see some of the measures that were taken, like water use optimization, costing batch washing instead of continuous wash, efficient boiler operation, and other things which I would say are basically relatively straightforward. It's engineering 101. It's what people should do if they run an industrial process, but have maybe not yet done and practice in that regard. So there's a business case for doing this, and this rests on profitability and market access. So profitability comes mainly from cost savings. We use less materials, less energy, less water, so we pay less on our bills for these supplies. And we have productivity enhancements because more of the material goes into product, so we have more product, and we see then also quality improvements. The other items, and are more less immediately tangible, but I think that once we see, particularly in small and medium-sized enterprises, that if we start working on these issues of resource efficiency and cleaner production, we create teams, we create enterprises which are agile and which can more easily respond to other changes. And of course, let us not forget that there's still a non-compliance gap in many developing countries. So with resource efficiency, cleaner production, we can assist on meeting the compliance standards. So it's the best way for achieving compliance. So UNIDO and the UN Environment have been working on this for quite some time, almost more closer to 25 years, with creating service providers around the world, which is then called this Resource Efficient and Clean Production Network, RCP Net. These are working on information and awareness, capacity building, assessment of enterprises, policy support, and also assisting with transfer of technologies and investment in there. And then some of the organizations in India here are the CII, Confederation of Indian Industry, Foundation of MSME Clusters, and the Gujarat Cleaner Production Center. So then I want to say that this resource efficient and cleaner production is a concept which applies to single enterprises, but we of course want to grow beyond that. And then we come to this concept of eco-industrial parks, where we basically say, as a starting point, once we have optimized one enterprise, we can then optimize the industrial park or zone it's part of by looking at its water and energy use and reuse between companies in the industrial park. So water which is not pure enough for one company can be used by another company where it's still suitable. Or you could look at low grade heat discharged by one company because they can't melt iron with it anymore. It might still be okay as a heat source for drying textiles or other things. So we see this water and energy networks being created, but we can also do this for materials, so secondary resources. So the proverb is the waste from one company can be utilized by another company, and that's then often referred to as industrial symbiosis. I don't have much time to expand on this, but I just put here some publications because UNIDO has really worked on, together with the World Bank and GIZ, on a number of publications to show how eco-industrial parks can be implemented in different industrial parks. So we see then from our work an emerging typology on this in the eco-industrial parks, and there's four there. The one on the top left corner is the like-minded industries which all have good individual environmental performance, and they can't exchange waste streams or energy streams, but they can exchange good practices on energy efficiency, waste management, and so on, because the materials cannot be matched. But you will see clubs of enterprises emerging which all have come together on the base of commitment to the environment. On the left-hand side, the bottom, then you see industrial symbiosis, where you see cooperating industries that optimize resource use by reusing each other's waste. So that is, we see that very much in minerals processing, petrochemical industries, that waste from one company can be utilized or to create utility islands which are serving multiple enterprises. On the top right corner, you see the environmental technology parks, where you see industries involved in the manufacturing of environmental goods cooperating, very much as we see also in the automotive sector, that you see an assembly plant, and you see a number of companies around it which manufacture tires, wheels, all different parts. And we see the same emerging now with new energy parks, for example, in China or also in Austria and Europe, which are basically conglomerates of industries that all work together to make PV panels or PV products or windmills like that. And then the last one on the right-hand bottom corner is resource recovery park, or what the Japanese would say eco-town, where industries are cooperating to deliver environmental services to sustainable cities. You could say that one company is accepting the waste stream and doing the initial sorting, and then the plastics go to another company which is doing plastics recovery from it, and other paper going to somebody else. And in that sense, you get a maze of reverse logistics and recovery operations. So that's the work on kind of eco-industrial parks as an extension of this enterprise level resource efficiency and clean production. But we should, in an industrial park, we should always start at the core with making each of the companies clean within their own operations, and then look at the opportunities which are created by having multiple enterprises in the same location. Then the third component is the kind of the recycle perpetually, and I would say that's embedding man-made systems into the natural ecosystem. So this is a more multi-pronged agenda to recover value from previously discarded waste. So we're looking for recovery of materials, water, and or energy. So not necessarily always as a material, sometimes better as a water or energy source in all life cycle stages. So it's the waste which comes from the mining, which comes from the processing, which comes from manufacturing, and also, of course, final consumption, with the ultimate purpose to, of course, then have the double agenda. So we perpetually retain man-made materials into man-made systems. So things which are non-renewable should be kept in technical systems, technical ingredients, plastics, steel, and so on should stay in man-made systems. But we can, if we look at organic material, and maybe also paper, we can see that we can release the natural materials back into the environment, but we should then do this at nature's capacity and at its pace. So if you overload with organic material, then of course the environment can also not take care of that. And we should take care of the environmental risks, and particularly I think if you look at the more engineered materials now, we are, because of the increasing material complexity of all waste, we have challenges to dismantle products and to take take care of the nasty ones, which are potentially hazardous. We see this, for example, in the e-waste, of course, most visible as a compilation of hazardous materials and precious materials and common recyclables. And this is then facilitated by a conducive policy framework that basically we need to discourage or prevent the disposal of waste. We can only get the circular economy going by closing the back door. So there's no way to go with your waste except for recycling and reuse. And encourage and mandate the use of recovered and recycled resources. So that's looking at setting specifications that new steel has to have so much recycled content and other areas. And of course, this is also an area for facilitating support, innovation and investment there. So a few opportunities there in terms of closing the loop. Arvind is the largest denim producer in India, and they have circularity in their denim processing. So 70% of the water use is already recycled, 50% of the fuels, 20% of the recycled. So that's post-consumer jeans going back into new jeans, 20%, and salt recovery. We can drive this further. So you see this pure waste textiles. So you have 100% post-consumer recycled t-shirts already in the market. We can then also see using more renewable materials. This is waste from well. So Sachi innovation from Ahmedabad, they make biodegradable sanitary pads from waste banana fiber, fully 100% biodegradable and 100% from an organic waste stream. Then Aspartica is a company from Bangalore, which extracts now omega-3 fatty acids, which is a nutrachemical. It's a food supplement from basically what's left over from the silkworms once you extract the silk thread. And Bristle is a company in Gujarat as well that basically extract the silica from the ash which is left over if you use rice husk, and they produce that with this silica an additive for tires, which reduces then the rolling resistance of the tires, which translates back into fuel efficiency gains with the vehicle in its life cycle. So I come somewhere to my final one. I think that productivity and innovation are enabling the transition to the circular economy. I put here the 3 strategies again. I think that we of course, the distinguishing part of circular economy is closing the loop, which is on the right-hand side, so value recovery from all waste. But we need to start before that's also with relentlessly practicing efficiency, so improving the efficiency of use of all resources, and then also maximizing, so that the efficiency is then dematerialization in the loop, so making the circles thinner in that sense, and making the loops then also more based on renewable materials, so go renewables. I think with that, I would like to close. I put here a few logos of the initiatives that UNIDO is working on, the RCP network, and you mentioned the Clean Tech Innovation Program, which shows new technologies, the global network of sustainable energy centers, which are working on local sustainability initiatives. The Green Chemistry Initiative is looking at applications of green chemistry, green engineering, solving the e-waste problem is a cooperation on e-waste, and the global platform for waste management is our cooperation with UN agencies and others on waste management and with the waste management industry. So thank you very much for that. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, René. Very, very interesting. And it also answered probably a couple of the questions that we already had on the way, like, for example, what is your favorite industry where changes have already taken place? I have one very concrete question that you can answer sort of on the run. Jumoke Oladejo asked, does RECP net also provide training and capacity building in developing countries, i.e. in African countries?
Yes, the RCP network covers about 50 countries, and I think at least a quarter of them, without knowing the exact number, are in Africa, South Africa, Kenya, Ethiopia, Egypt, Morocco. There's all centers which are working on this kind of initiatives, and many others in Africa as well.
Great. I think a number of the other questions I would like to postpone until we have time to discuss. There were already relating to finance, there were relating to training, and some participants have already sort of given advice amongst each other. That's rather wonderful when you have that means of engaging in a chat. So, for example, the MacArthur Foundation was mentioned by Jessica McGarty as a go-to place, and I know that the MacArthur Foundation is also cooperating with the International Resource Panel, which takes us now to our third presenter. And I think in my moderation I already said that Peda Jensen is the head of the Secretariat of the International Resource Panel, and I also mentioned that especially for the Argentinian presidency of the G20, the RRP has produced a paper where it shows sort of especially the diverse path towards development and the diverse path towards material use in the higher developed, in the medium size growing economies, and in the lower economies. And that is probably going to be part and parcel of what Peda is going to share with us. Last thing I want to share with you is that Peda has been looking at the issues for the last more than last 20 years, both for the EU and for national governments. So Peda, take it away.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to speak, and also to the previous speakers. Very interesting to see how some of the work that we are doing are, of course, also linking up to what you are doing. The presentation that I will run through this afternoon is just, I want to give just a very, very brief introduction to the resource panel, because there may be people out there who are not completely familiar with who we are. Then, as Connie said, we have been developing some key messages for the Group of 20, or the G20, for the meeting that they held in Argentina just a few months ago. And then finally, I'll just take one example from the paper we presented to the Argentinians and the Group of 20. There are much more in the report for people to read. The International Resource Panel it's a collaborative effort. We have a group of 38 panel members who are experts in a diversity of areas like cities, food systems, natural resource protection, and so on and so forth. And we have a steering committee consisting of more than 25 governments, the European Commission, UN Environment, and so on. And the division of responsibilities between these two is that the steering committee, the countries that are involved in this, will have a role in saying what are the types of issues we would like to have analyzed. They, of course, have a dialogue with the researchers, but the important thing is that it's from the policy side that we get the policy questions to be researched. But then the panel work in an independent manner. The work is going through both internal reviews, but also external scientific peer review, in order to secure that the answers that are coming out are scientifically valid answers. And that then goes back again to the steering committee members, and of course, because this is shared with everyone, in principle to all countries, so that they can use the conclusions that we are finding, can use that in their development of policies at the national level and also at the international level. So that is the division of responsibilities, and I think it's important to recognize that there is this independence in the way the work is done. Over the past 12-13 years, the panel has developed quite a number of reports looking both at a very technical level, at very specific resources. There's been a lot of look at metals, for instance, looking at biomass, looking at a number of issues of that nature, but also a number of more, shall we say, systemic reports looking either at cities as a system, looking at decoupling as a principle, looking at the interaction between resource efficiency and climate change. And the paper that I will be talking about today is a paper that is made as a summary of some of this work for the G20 countries. The key messages coming out of this paper is, or maybe I should just take one step back and say we actually did a study that was commissioned by the G7, where they asked us to look into what are some of the economic implications of using resource efficiency policies. And that work was reported to the G7 in early 2017. Based on that, we have been going further and are doing some more work linking closer the resource efficiency story with the climate story and looking at some of that, and I'll come back a little to that in a little while. But then the G20 countries, of course, represent the G20 countries plus a number of other countries, ask us to say, well, if we are taking the results that we found there and looking broader into our databases, what would be the equivalent type of conclusions just for the G20 countries? And because the G20 countries represent a much wider diversity of countries, I think what we have here is also something that is a lot more globally valid and therefore has, shall we say, more relevance for all countries in the world. But if we start by looking just at the status and trends around resource use and resource efficiency, then the G20 countries that we're looking at here are responsible for about 2/3 of global material use, and of course it's a number of very big countries that are in there, so that may be relatively natural. But another trend is that the G20 has, on average, a higher growth rate for material use than we see for the rest of the world, meaning that they are, in a sense, taking off. But we'll come to that in a little while, because we will see that there are also a division within the countries. 4 of the 9 planetary boundaries that science have described are being surpassed with the type of consumption that we have today. And if we look at some of the numbers on, say, recycling rates, then only 1/3 of metals are actually being recycled at a rate of above 50%. And if we look at some of the more specialty metals or the rare earth elements, then it's less than 1% that is being recycled. 33% or 1/3 of our soil is degraded to some extent. 20% of our aquifers are being overexploited. Almost 30% of commercial fish stocks are overfished. So we are using our resources in an unsustainable manner, and I think that is fully recognized. But sometimes it's important to get the numbers in there. If we then start to look at the difference between countries, then you can divide the G20 countries into high-income countries and what we call high middle income and lower middle income countries. And if we look at the high-income countries, then they actually use 10 times more natural resource than the lower or lower middle income countries. So there's a very, very wide range of, so we say, consumption patterns within these countries. And if we look at the consumption of the poorest people on this planet, and here we are looking globally, not just at the G20, then the poorest 1/6 of the population of 1.2 billion people consume only 1% of the overall resources that are being used, whereas the billion richest people on the planet consume something like 72% of the resources. So there's a huge discrepancy in the draw on the planet's resources. And if we look at the development, again, now this is then within the G20, look at the development between the richer countries and the poorer countries within that group, then we can see that the richer countries have a relatively stable use of resources, while the middle part of those countries, being Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, Russia, South Africa, and China, have been taking off over the past 25 years. And actually reached the point where they have surpassed in absolute volumes per capita the material consumption of the richest countries. Whereas we are seeing some of the poorest countries within this group, India and Indonesia, being in this data set at a relatively low level. But bear in mind the graph we saw around India in the first presentation here, where the projection is that there's a takeoff in material consumption in India as well. Then that, I think, serves to illustrate part of the challenge that we are looking at. And if we look at the pressure that this is adding on our natural resources, we can see that in a business as usual projection, that things are only going to get worse. By 2030, we expect the food requirement will increase by 60%. Again, considering a business as usual scenario where we take the consumption patterns from the richer countries and see how they, with growing affluence, are spreading. And at the same time, we have sustainable development goals saying we should fight hunger. So, I mean, all of these things are tying together to lift the demand for food. That again translates into increased water use by about 40%, and by 2050 we would need an increase in cropland of about 55%. And tie that then back to the number I showed in the beginning, where 33% of cropland today is moderately to medium level degraded. Then it means that we have a very significant risk that we would have a very strong pressure on the cropland, and thereby a significant pressure on biodiversity resources as well. So in the previous presentations, you already heard about resource efficiency and how resource efficiency can help address these changes. So let me just sum up this slide very briefly by saying it's really about getting more from less. It's about getting better economic outcomes and well-being while using fewer natural resources and reducing the environmental releases coming out of that. And doing that really entails a number of different elements, both getting greater value from the resources by using fewer resources per product, but also making sure that once a resource or a material is in the use cycle, it can stay in that use cycle much longer, so that built-in obsolescence and things like that, that means that lots of products very quickly end in landfills, should be something of the past. So it's looking at all of these elements that we heard also about in the previous presentations. If we then look in a little bit more detail at the study we did first for the G7, where we were looking at the economic implications of doing resource efficiency, because the question there we were being asked was really what will it cost to do resource efficiency, or what can we gain from it? What are the benefits? And the projections that we have done, looking at a number of different resource efficiency policies and how they would affect the overall economic equations, is that by 2050, with a strong emphasis on resource efficiency policies, we would be able to reduce global use of natural resources by 28%. But that is compared to a business as usual, where we were expected then to pretty much double the consumption compared to today. So in absolute terms, we are still talking about an increase, but an increase that is much smaller than what we were otherwise looking at. What is interesting was that as we were doing the study, we started to also look into what is the link with climate policies, because if you use less resources, in one way or another, you also save some emissions. So if you couple that with strong emphasis also on greenhouse gas emission reductions, what potential do you then get from a combination of resource efficiency and climate policies? And what we found was that it was possible to get a 63% reduction in overall greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 at a global level. And bear in mind that the scientific agreement is that we should, at a global level, more than half the greenhouse gas emissions. So this is actually showing a pathway to deliver on the 2-degree target, maybe not on the 1.5-degree target, but on the 2-degree target, so that resource efficiency becomes a very important part of that. At the same time, we could see that there was a potential to increase the GDP in the G20 countries when we started looking at them in particular, by combining all of these different policies, because we are creating more jobs, we are creating more activity with some of these investments that will be needed in order to achieve some of the resource efficiency targets. So overall, there's actually an increase in economic activity, which is contrary to some of the projections where you're just looking at climate policies, where you're very often talking about what is the cost of reducing climate change. We are pointing here at a pathway that allows countries to have economic growth while at the same time also reducing the impact on climate change. And then, of course, the obvious question is, where is this potential and what is it that we should be doing? We have been looking at a broad range of different policies, and the top 15 are listed in the graph here on the right side, with building energy efficiency and large-scale farm yields and food waste as being the 3 major ones where there's something to be gained. If we look at energy and water efficiency, then we can see that it's technically possible and commercially viable, both in construction, agriculture, food, industry, transport, and other sectors compared to conventional technologies, to do these 60 to 80% improvements. So there are very, very large improvements. And of course, a lot of the economic benefit comes from these very large improvements. And maybe we should also point out that there are a lot of jobs to be created, because there's not just jobs linked to implementing these, but also to running a lot of these. I mean, if we start to look at, say, things like remanufacturing within industry, where you do an industrial scale reuse of sub parts of products in order to extend the lifetime of them, then that in itself generates an enormous amount of jobs compared to very large industrial scale production of new materials. Just a few words on the fact that, of course, this is very much linked to Sustainable Development Goals, because for us that is the overarching framework. And if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, what you will see is that almost all of them have some kind of a resource component to them, and therefore it's important to recognize that resource efficiency and management of natural resources is an essential part if you want to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. There's a lot that can be gained with smart new technologies, but if you do not manage natural resources on a grand scale, then you are never going to meet all of these goals. If we then again come back to some of the work that we're doing first for the G20 and then adapting to see it also for the G20, then let me just mention that when we were doing that, we were looking very much at resource use and greenhouse gas emissions and climate. and looking at 4 different scenarios. I was mentioning that we were looking at existing trends and then doing resource efficiency, or existing trends and then doing climate policy, and then adding all of them up. And here we have the numbers showing, again, with the different groups of countries, how this is going to affect economically the different countries, and how much it will decrease their material use. And then to come towards a conclusion here on this part, just to say that if we want countries to move ahead, then one of the important things that can drive policy action is very often to have a target. We know from climate discussions and from climate policy that the 2-degree target has been seen as a very important way and as a lever to get a debate on are we doing well enough? What is it that we should be doing? Because somehow people can relate to a 2-degree target in a way that they can't relate to so many other things. For material consumption, we do not have targets at this point in time. In the scientific community, there's now quite a lot of debate about what science-based targets could be, recognizing that, of course, science can say what targets ought to be. Policymakers will then design a policy saying this is then the target we will be aiming at. But a number of countries and regions are taking steps forward by starting to develop indicators, and I see indicators very much as a first step towards having a target. And just to mention, Japan working with a direct material input indicator, and the European Union having the domestic material consumption indicator. So steps in the direction of starting to have a measurement that can eventually turn into a target, but there's still a need to find out what should that target then be. Then very briefly, and just one example and just one slide on an example from Mexico. In Mexico, or maybe we should start by recognizing that buildings, you saw that in the graph before, that buildings is one of the main areas where there's something to be gained in terms of resource use. Buildings use around 40% of resources and 25% of water and 40% of energy on a global scale. And in that sense, they have a very large contribution to our overall footprint. In Mexico, they established something called the Green Mortgage Fund, which was supposed to help working class people get access to proper housing. And over a period of 5 years, that they granted more than 900,000 mortgages that benefited more than 3 million people with relatively low subsidized interest rates, but under the condition that the houses that would be financed out of these mortgages would be built with energy-saving materials and with eco-efficient technologies. In order to pay for this, people had to pay a mortgage that on average was $6 higher per month than it would have been otherwise. On the other hand, they would save about $17 on the monthly bills that they had to pay for energy and water and so on. And in that sense, people could not necessarily initially afford the investment in being more resource efficient, but over time, everybody would gain. I mean, society would gain because we are more resource efficient, and the individual would gain as well by having both houses in a better quality than they would otherwise, with better insulation and so on, and at the same time making money. So the social element that is also part of the SDG package comes in here. Evaluations of this scheme has shown that there's, for these houses, there's about a 60% reduction in gas, a 50% reduction in electricity, and a 40% reduction in, 60% in water, 50% in gas, and 40% in electricity reduction. And that adds up to a reduction of about 3/4 of a ton of carbon emission per household per year. So very concrete savings that can be used in a country when they are starting to develop their national plans for reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, because this is validated that this can actually help. So with that, I would like to thank and hand back to Connie.
And Renee and Zinat, I love it when machines talk to you and tell you that you can do what you are doing anyway. Now we do have a number of questions, and one of the questions was, yes, are there? Okay, I think that was somebody else sort of getting into the conversation. I think one of the issues that will be met by many people in the industry and in organizations is put forward by Jumoke Oladejo, is driving circular economy easy in countries without effective policy or legislative tools to actually drive the change in industry. And the questioner was referring to the fact that, you know, if in doubt, do as you always have done in the past. So I'm not quite sure who might want to pick up that question, but I think actually, Zinat, you referred a lot to the mind change that needs to be behind it, i.e. if things cost the same, but you can do it in a more ecologically, in a more resource efficient, and in the end, more circular fashion, what will drive you to do that? Is it policies? Is it just simple grand ideas? What will make people do the right thing?
I think we need to look at, or rather disaggregate the people. So let's look at the people who are consumers as well as people who are the producers, and both of them have to do the right thing. Taking the same example that I was using of the construction sector, if I look at the user of the housing, of the affordable housing, you know, as Peda mentioned in the last thing, it is going to be benefits, the short-term benefits of being able to afford that housing, and the operational benefits of being able to you know, have lower bills of electricity and water, you know, and whatnot, which are going to enable them to make those choices. From the production end, who's going to be, you know, what is going to drive the producers to make greener, resource efficient construction materials and housing is going to be, of course, the business benefits that they will get. And the business benefits are going to come from the production of materials as well as from the production of housing, both creation of a supply chain for all the materials that we need, as well as from the project developers. And these might come in from tax benefits. These might come in from cheaper refinance that could be provided, and of course enlarging their consumer base going forward. So it is going to be that benefit. At the end, the consumer will also be driven by the fact that they would want the service quality that they are getting to be of the same aspirational level that they are looking at. And I'll give you a very, very quick example. The challenge that is being faced by the construction and debris waste products is really when people know, oh, this is coming from a waste. Is it of the same quality? And the consumer, the one who's going to buy those products, has a big question mark on his face. So, you know, the ability to you know, accept the fact that this is going to be coming in from a recycled resource stream, and it's great to do that. So, you know, there's a status associated with being green, but there's also a cost associated. And so can I have a cheaper cost, or can I be at the same cost? But the quality has to be of the aspirational level that I have to have. So there's a huge public campaign knowledge and public awareness as well that is required at this point. There's also a requirement for certification of the product quality so that the consumer knowing that the certification is coming from a credible source, so that they know that yes, I have a product quality which is really top class. So that's what's going to drive the people who are going to be buying those houses or buying those materials, which is the growth of the market really.
Thank you, Zeenat. I'm just going to pick up on your idea of certification and just very quickly ask Renee and Peda, are you aware of certification systems that are already out there that are working? Like, you know, I'm using a product within the circular economy. I'm using a product that has been recycled 100% and is good. Renee?
Yes, if I can comment, I think there's different schemes are around now. So we see certainly the eco labels and then the recycled content labels and so on. And I think there's increasingly a trust on this, that this is particularly more trusted systems are out there, which show there's recycled content, there's progress towards the circular economy. You see also some private initiative like a cradle to cradle certification, which is out there. So I think maybe the biggest challenge is that the criteria and the labels are so diverse that for the consumer it's difficult to see which one is what. On one hand, I also say that it's good that we have diverse labels because it also gives companies an opportunity to differentiate themselves. But on the other hand, it disperses the market for, or the demand for circular products or recycled products. And I think coming back to the earlier question on the kind of the policy environment, yes, we need policy, but we need also to implement the policy. And I think that increasingly also the business sector is seeing that we can't afford to waste so much material. So I see also a tendency which is coming that the business itself is saying, yes, we need to look more proactively at minimizing the resource use to drive our competitiveness and be productive and competitive into the future.
Thank you very much. Peda, any systems that go beyond the national level, i.e. any systems that you see around that you have come across in the studies that are advisable?
Yeah, well, let me just take one example, because I think it's if you're looking at materials, then one of the issues, I mean, take Forest Stewardship Council, where they're looking at sustainable production of timber. That's an example of something. It started as an NGO, but it's seen as something that is in many countries being seen as some kind of a trustworthy certification of a proper way of producing your timber. But that being said, there are, as Renee was also saying, that there's a multitude of labels out there, and sometimes it's very difficult to find out what can be trusted and what cannot be trusted. And I think there's a need for a lot more international collaboration and certification of certification schemes. I mean, what can actually be trusted out there in order to make sure that it can also enter into, say, international negotiations on trade agreements. Because if say EU would want to start saying that we will only buy metals that is sustainably produced, then they would have a hard time finding certification schemes they could trust, and it may run counter to WTO rules. So there are lots of political elements in there as well.
We have around about 10 minutes left. On the way to getting to the 2 or 3 finance questions, I think, which are very important. Just very quickly, Renee, you mentioned the industrial parks, which are providing a win-win situation. Now, of course, these industrial parks, i.e., one company can use the waste of the other one, and so it becomes circular. In fact, in that environment. That seems to be mainly designed for new build-ups of industry. Now, in most countries, we have legacy systems. How do we deal with those?
Let me correct, because I think that also in existing industrial parks we see opportunities arising for this waste exchange, and actually that it's quite controversial, but it's actually probably the fact that eco-industrial parks which have been designed for eco-industrial exchanges have been typically the least successful, and the ones which have more organically grown between enterprises have been more successful, like Kallenburg or Kawasaki or Inane in Australia, versus ones which have been planned and where then ultimately there's no business ecosystem that sustains them. I think we talk about with the legacy issue, and that is more dealing with the big landfills, and whereas a lot of resources are basically locked up. I think we don't have a solution in that from an eco-industrial park perspective. There is just, I think, as we've also seen in Europe and in the US in the 80s and the 90s, we had to deal with the Superfund sites at some point in time, that we had large legacies which have to be contained in different parts, and this is still in the developing world still a challenge to be done, and we need to basically also stop the bleeding in that regard, as they would say, that we are still running mine sites where there's lots of waste being deposited and so on, that we start at least to not make the problem even bigger, that we start with adopting environmental practices, environmental sound practices, and then at the same time find a way forward that we can deal with the huge landfills, as we've seen also in the last year in several places in the world, that landfills have collapsed and caused casualties and a lot of damage to the environment. So the legacy issue is probably not something which we can solve with a resource efficiency perspective, but we need an environmental management and environmental risk approach to that.
A lot of it is based, a lot of what Peda, you said, was based on strategy, on policies carried through, and I believe Zinat and René, a lot of the incentives that we see are sort of based on nudging as well. Now, it all comes clear when it gets to finance. Now, first of all, does the financial sector actually look at the aspect of circular economy to a large enough extent as yet? We've seen it with sustainability. It started there, that nowadays companies have to produce a sustainability report, not yet a report that shows that they are part and parcel of the circular economy. Getting there. So what do we need from the finance sector? And then there were 2 or 3 rather targeted questions. I'm just going to throw them out. You might want to sort of get to them. How do we arrive at the optimal depreciation rate arrived by the tax department to encourage the efforts on circular economy in India? And is there any change in depreciation rate of plant and machinery needed before we get into the circular economy? And I think Zinat, with the last 2 specific questions, I think you might want to start. And René's hand movement was saying that he is going to jump in as well.
Yeah, if I may, because you asked on the financial sector, and I think the financial sector is getting it with regard to the new business models, the circular business models, because we see huge investments coming into the new companies, the sharing platforms which are around, the bike sharing. Oyo is a big company. Uber has become a big company. So we see change, and the banks are understanding this. I think the banks and the financial institutions have more difficulty to actually get the idea of resource efficiency. So basically doing more with less is kind of in a perception that they are looking for financial flow, so for basically increased sales or so, which can refund a loan. And if we do efficiency, we have not more biscuits to sell, but we've just spent less money on making the biscuits. And that has been traditionally a very more complicated sell. There's no direct cash flow, but there's an avoided cash flow, and to capture on that has been a challenge. And I think also Zinat was referring to that earlier on in India, but also elsewhere in the developing world. There's a large degree of informality and small and medium-sized enterprises which have a huge difficulty in even getting access to finance in the first place. So it's not specific to deal with the circular economy or resource efficiency, but the small business and banks are just not willing to extend loans or credit to micro and small enterprises, and therefore also not to the circular economy initiatives which they might have. Thank you.
So small and medium enterprises still need to catch up or be sort of more in the focus of the financial sector. Peda and Zinat, you are both trying to jump in. Zinat maybe first, and then Peda. And could you please be a little bit brief? Sorry.
Very quickly, on the small and medium enterprise space, I think besides looking at the issues of credit and financing, a huge big space that is required is the is platforms for knowledge and aggregation support systems that the small and medium enterprises need. I would like to put in a space which needs to come in, and we were at the crest, like I said, of the digital economy, and we the current blockchain and the current AI systems, they actually can be a huge boon for the MSMEs if we are looking at decentralized small-scale production and reaching out to large markets. So if there are technology sort of inputs into the small and medium sector supported by these information knowledge aggregation systems, this can actually turn the tables for the MSMEs. I just want to give one little pointer on the legacy issue that René pointed out on the huge resources lying there locked, and I do call them resources because countries like ours need those kind of resources. We do not have anymore the materials to build and to grow, and it is from here which are the secondary resources, which are the new resource lines that we are going to get our materials from. So a lot of that is something that we need to tap within our countries as well.
Thank you very much, Peda.
Yeah, just coming back to what René was talking about with the finance sector. Yes, there's a lot of interest in the finance sector, but I think it's also important to recognize that it's a sector that is in there to make money, and we need to ensure as policymakers that we make it possible for them to do so, and that shall we say, the financially right choice is then also the environmentally right choice. And the only real thing we can do there is to work with a taxation system. The way we are taxing labor very high and resources relatively low means that we are making the wrong decisions again and again. And in the end, it is something that we need to change the way we tax the use of resources versus the way we tax labor. And that will then drive that it's easy to make the right choice.
All I wanted to say is we've overrun by 10 minutes. Thank you all for your additional time. That wasn't necessarily planned, but we did take some time and maybe one or two presentations overran a tad. So I think that's part and parcel when you're actually into a subject. Now, I just wanted to say thank you to all the questions and to all the people who have actually put down the questions. A number of them you actually exchanged amongst each other, but I'm very sure that René, Zinat and Peda are there for you and will answer questions if you send them by email. I know, very old-fashioned. That just reminds me, and I want a one-sentence answer from you each. Zinat, how important is ICT going to be in solving the issue?
Tremendously. It is going to be a platform where small-scale industry of our country is going to jump in and take the benefits. Absolutely.
René?
I think it's essential in terms of better information on what resources are available, but also spreading the technical solutions which are ultimately necessary to make resource efficiency and circular business models.
And Peda?
A fair taxation system requires traceability, it requires access to data and transparency, as René was saying. So yes, IT will become incredibly important in this.
Great, and it already is within the climate change action part, so we can learn from each other. We don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel. That is going to help drive the circular economy. I hope, ladies and gentlemen, that you did enjoy the hour and 3/4 with us that we've had together. Any more questions, please put them to the organizers. You can definitely get more information on the greengrowthknowledge.org website. And each and every participant also heads websites that will give more information amongst each other. You've mentioned another couple as well. This webinar, Doing More with Less or More, Rebuilding Capital in a Circular Economy, is of course one step, one milestone on a long path that we're all going together. I wish all of us a lot of energy on that. That's certainly something that doesn't run out. Time does. So thank you very much, Zinat Niazi, to India, probably a couple of hours ahead. Peda Jensen, Paris time, and René van Berkel in Vienna. And that's it for today. Keep continuing, keep pushing the issue, and let's attempt that we actually get this global economy a bit more circular than today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.